here with you. She was fascinating when she smiled with her eyes, like that. He thought you had one of those hearts that never grow old. Phil had real insight. He was not taken in by this flattery spoken out of the past, out of a longing to talk of her dead lover, not a bit, and yet it was precious to hear, because she pleased his eyes and heart which, quite true, had never grown old. Was that because, unlike her and her dead lover, he had never loved to desperation, had always kept his balance, his sense of symmetry? Well, it had left him power, at 84, to admire beauty. And he thought, if I were a painter or a sculptor. But I'm an old chap. Make hay while the sun shines. A couple with arms entwined crossed on the grass before them, at the edge of the shadow from their tree. The sunlight fell cruelly on their pale, squashed, unkempt young faces. "We're an ugly lot," said old Jolyon suddenly. "It amazes me to see how love triumphs over that. Love triumphs over everything." "The young think so," he muttered. "Love has no age, no limit, and no death." With that glow in her pale face, her breast heaving, her eyes so large and dark and soft, she looked like Venus come to life. But this extravagance brought instant reaction, and, twinkling, he said, "Well, if it had limits, we shouldn't be born, for by George, it's got a lot to put up with." Then, removing his top hat, he brushed it round with a cuff. The great clumsy thing heated his forehead. In these days he often got a rush of blood to the head, his circulation was not what it had been. She still sat gazing straight before her, and suddenly she murmured, "It's strange enough that I'm alive." Those words of Joe's wild and lost came back to him. "Ah," he said, "my son saw you for a moment, that day." "Was it your son?" "I heard a voice in the hall, I thought for a second it was Phil." Old Jolyon saw her lips tremble. She put her hand over them, took it away again, and went on calmly, "That night I went to the embankment, a woman caught me by the dress. She told me about herself. When one knows that others suffer, one's ashamed. One of those." She nodded, and horror stirred within old Jolyon, the horror of one who has never known a struggle with desperation. Almost against his will he muttered, "Tell me, won't you? I didn't care whether I lived or died. When you're like that, fate ceases to want to kill you. She took care of me 3 days, she never left me. I had no money. That's why I do what I can for them, now." But old Jolyon was thinking, no money. What fate could compare with that? Every other was involved in it. "I wish you had come to me," he said. "Why didn't you?" But Irene did not answer. "Because my name was Forsyte, I suppose. Or was it June who kept you away? How are you getting on now?" His eyes involuntarily swept her body. Perhaps even now she was. And yet she wasn't thin, not really. "Oh, with my £50 a year, I make just enough." The answer did not reassure him. He had lost confidence. And that fellow Soames. But his sense of justice stifled condemnation. No, she would certainly have died rather than take another penny from him. Soft as she looked, there must be strength in her somewhere, strength and fidelity. But what business had young Bosinney to have got run over and left her stranded like this? "Well, you must come to me now," he said, "for anything you want, or I shall be quite cut up." And putting on his hat, he rose. "Let's go and get some tea. I told that lazy chap to put the horses up for an hour, and come for me at your place. We'll take a cab presently, I can't walk as I used to." He enjoyed that stroll to the Kensington end of the gardens, the sound of her voice, the glancing of her eyes, the subtle beauty of a charming form moving beside him. He enjoyed their tea at Ruffles in the High Street, and came out thence with a great box of chocolates swung on his little finger. He enjoyed the drive back to Chelsea in a hansom, smoking his cigar. She had promised to come down next Sunday and play to him again, and already in thought he was plucking carnations and early roses for her to carry back to town. It was a pleasure to give her a little pleasure, if it were pleasure from an old chap like him. The carriage was already there when they arrived. Just like that fellow, who was always late when he was wanted. Old Jolyon went in for a minute to say goodbye. The little dark hall of the flat was impregnated with a disagreeable odor of patchouli, and on a bench against the wall, its only furniture, he saw a figure sitting. He heard Irene say softly, "Just 1 minute." In the little drawing-room when the door was shut, he asked gravely, "One of your protégées?" "Yes. Now thanks to you, I can do something for her." He stood, staring, and stroking that chin whose strength had frightened so many in its time. The idea of her thus actually in contact with this outcast grieved and frightened him. What could she do for them? Nothing. Only soil and make trouble for herself, perhaps. And he said, "Take care, my dear. The world puts the worst construction on everything. I know that." He was abashed by her quiet smile. "Well then, Sunday," he murmured, "goodbye." She put her cheek forward for him to kiss. "Goodbye," he said again, "take care of yourself." And he went out, not looking towards the figure on the bench. He drove home by way of Hammersmith, that he might stop at a place he knew of and tell them to send her in 24 of their best Burgundy. She must want picking up sometimes. Only in Richmond Park did he remember that he had gone up to order himself some boots, and was surprised that he could have had so paltry an idea. The little spirits of the past which throng an old man's days had never pushed their faces up to his so seldom as in the 70 hours elapsing before Sunday came. The spirit of the future, with the charm of the unknown, put up her lips instead. Old Jolyon was not restless now, and paid no visits to the log, because she was coming to lunch. There is wonderful finality about a meal, it removes a world of doubts, therefore no one misses meals except for reasons beyond control. He played many games with Holly on the lawn, pitching them up to her who was batting so as to be ready to bowl to Jolly in the holidays. For she was not a Forsyte, but Jolly was, and Forsytes always bat, until they have resigned and reached the age of 85. The dog Balthasar, in attendance, lay on the ball as often as he could, and the page boy fielded, till his face was like the harvest moon. And because the time was getting shorter, each day was longer and more golden than the last. On Friday night he took a liver pill. His side hurt him rather, and though it was not the liver side, there is no remedy like that. Anyone telling him that he had found a new excitement in life and that excitement was not good for him, would have been met by one of those steady and rather defiant looks of his deep-set iron-grey eyes, which seemed to say, "I know my own business best." He always had and always would. On Sunday morning, when Holly had gone with her governess to church, he visited the strawberry beds. There, accompanied by the dog Balthasar, he examined the plants narrowly and succeeded in finding at least 24 berries which were really ripe. Stooping was not good for him, and he became very dizzy and red in the forehead. Having placed the strawberries in a dish on the dining table, he washed his hands and bathed his forehead with eau de cologne. There, before the mirror, it occurred to him that he was thinner. What a threadpaper he had been when he was young! It was nice to be slim. He could not bear a fat chap, and yet perhaps his cheeks were too thin. She was to arrive by train at 12:30 and walk up, entering from the road past Drage's farm at the far end of the coppice. And, having looked into June's room to see that there was hot water ready, he set forth to meet her, leisurely, for his heart was beating. The air smelled sweet, larks sang, and the grand stand at Epsom was visible. A perfect day. On just such a one, no doubt, 6 years ago, Soames had brought young Bosinney down with him to look at the site before they began to build. It was Bosinney who had pitched on the exact spot for the house, as June had often told him. In these days he was thinking much about that young fellow, as if his spirit were really haunting the field of his last work, on the chance of seeing her. Bosinney, the one man who had possessed her heart, to whom she had given her whole self with rapture. At his age one could not, of course, imagine such things, but there stirred in him a queer vague aching, as it were the ghost of an impersonal jealousy, and a feeling, too, more generous, of pity for that love so early lost. All over in a few poor months. Well, well. He looked at his watch before entering the coppice, only 25 minutes to wait. And then, turning the corner of the path, he saw her exactly where he had seen her the first time, on the log, and realized that she must have come by the earlier train to sit there alone for a couple of hours at least. 2 hours of her society missed. What memory could make that log so dear to her? His face showed what he was thinking, for she said at once, "Forgive me, Uncle Jolyon, it was here that I first knew." "Yes, yes, there it is for you whenever you like." You're looking a little Londony, you're giving too many lessons. That she should have to give lessons worried him. Lessons to a parcel of young girls thumping out scales with their thick fingers. Where do you go to give them? He asked. They're mostly Jewish families, luckily. Old Jolyon stared. To all Forsytes Jews seem strange and doubtful. They love music, and they're very kind. They had better be, by George. He took her arm, his side always hurt him a little going uphill, and said, Did you ever see anything like those buttercups? They came like that in a night. Her eyes seemed really to fly over the field, like bees after the flowers and the honey. I wanted you to see them, wouldn't let them turn the cows in yet. Then, remembering that she had come to talk about Bosony, he pointed to the clock tower over the stables. I expect he wouldn't have let me put that there, had no notion of time, if I remember. But, pressing his arm to her, she talked of flowers instead, and he knew it was done that he might not feel she came because of her dead lover. The best flower I can show you, he said, with a sort of triumph, is my little sweet. She'll be back from church directly. There's something about her which reminds me a little of you, and it did not seem to him peculiar that he had put it thus, instead of saying, There's something about you which reminds me a little of her. Ah! And here she was. Holly, followed closely by her elderly French governess, whose digestion had been ruined 22 years ago in the siege of Strasbourg, came rushing towards them from under the oak tree. She stopped about a dozen yards away, to pat Balthasar and pretend that this was all she had in her mind. Old Jolyon, who knew better, said, Well, my darling, here's the lady in grey I promised you. Holly raised herself and looked up. He watched the two of them with a twinkle, Irene smiling, Holly beginning with grave inquiry, passing into a shy smile too, and then to something deeper. She had a sense of beauty, that child, knew what was what. He enjoyed the sight of the kiss between them. Mrs. Heron, Mam'selle Beauce. Well, Mam'selle, good sermon. For, now that he had not much more time before him, the only part of the service connected with this world absorbed what interest in church remained to him. Mam'selle Beauce stretched out a spidery hand clad in a black kid glove. She had been in the best families, and the rather sad eyes of her lean yellowish face seemed to ask, Are you well, Bred? Whenever Holly or Jolly did anything unpleasing to her, a not uncommon occurrence, she would say to them, The little Taylors never did that. They were such well-bred little children. Jolly hated the little Taylors. Holly wondered dreadfully how it was she fell so short of them. A thin rum little soul, old Jolyon thought her, Mam'selle Beauce. Luncheon was a successful meal. The mushrooms which he himself had picked in the mushroom house, his chosen strawberries, and another bottle of the Steinberg cabinet filled him with a certain aromatic spirituality, and a conviction that he would have a touch of eczema tomorrow. After lunch they sat under the oak tree drinking Turkish coffee. It was no matter of grief to him when Mademoiselle Beauce withdrew to write her Sunday letter to her sister, whose future had been endangered in the past by swallowing a pin, an event held up daily in warning to the children to eat slowly and digest what they had eaten. At the foot of the bank, on a carriage rug, Holly and the dog Balthasar teased and loved each other, and in the shade old Jolyon, with his legs crossed and his cigar luxuriously savored, gazed at Irene sitting in the swing. A light, vaguely swaying, grey figure with a fleck of sunlight here and there upon it, lips just opened, eyes dark and soft under lids a little drooped. She looked content. Surely it did her good to come and see him. The selfishness of age had not set its proper grip on him, for he could still feel pleasure in the pleasure of others, realizing that what he wanted, though much, was not quite all that mattered. "It's quiet here," he said. "You mustn't come down if you find it dull. But it's a pleasure to see you. My little sweet is the only face which gives me any pleasure, except yours." From her smile he knew that she was not beyond liking to be appreciated, and this reassured him. "That's not humbug," he said. "I never told a woman I admired her when I didn't. In fact, I don't know when I've told a woman I admired her, except my wife in the old days, and wives are funny." He was silent, but resumed abruptly, "She used to expect me to say it more often than I felt it, and there we were." Her face looked mysteriously troubled, and, afraid that he had said something painful, he hurried on, "When my little sweet marries, I hope she'll find someone who knows what women feel. I shan't be here to see it, but there's too much topsy-turvydom in marriage. I don't want her to pitch up against that." And, aware that he had made bad worse, he added, "That dog will scratch." A silence followed. Of what was she thinking, this pretty creature whose life was spoiled, who had done with love, and yet was made for love? Some day when he was gone, perhaps, she would find another mate, not so disorderly as that young fellow who had got himself run over. Ah! But her husband. "Does Soames never trouble you?" he asked. She shook her head. Her face had closed up suddenly. For all her softness there was something irreconcilable about her. And a glimpse of light on the inexorable nature of sex antipathies strayed into a brain which, belonging to early Victorian civilization, so much older than this of his old age, had never thought about such primitive things. "That's a comfort," he said. "You can see the grand stand today. Shall we take a turn round?" Through the flower and fruit garden, against whose high outer walls peach trees and nectarines were trained to the sun, through the stables, the vinery, the mushroom house, the asparagus beds, the rosary, the summer house, he conducted her, even into the kitchen garden to see the tiny green peas which Holly loved to scoop out of their pods with her finger, and lick up from the palm of her little brown hand. Many delightful things he showed her, while Holly and the dog Balthasar danced ahead, or came to them at intervals for attention. It was one of the happiest afternoons he had ever spent, but it tired him and he was glad to sit down in the music room and let her give him tea. A special little friend of Holly's had come in, a fair child with short hair like a boy's. And the two sported in the distance, under the stairs, on the stairs, and up in the gallery. Old Jolyon begged for Chopin. She played studies, mazurkas, waltzes, till the two children, creeping near, stood at the foot of the piano, their dark and golden heads bent forward, listening. Old Jolyon watched. "Let's see you dance, you two." Shyly, with a false start, they began. Bobbing and circling, earnest, not very adroit, they went past and past his chair to the strains of that waltz. He watched them, and the face of her who was playing turned smiling towards those little dancers, thinking, "Sweetest picture I've seen for ages." A voice said, "Holly, mais enfin, questionist ceq face la, danse, le dimanche. Viens, donc." But the children came close to old Jolyon, knowing that he would save them, and gazed into a face which was decidedly caught out. "Better the day, better the deed, mam'selle. It's all my doing. Trot along, chicks, and have your tea." And, when they were gone, followed by the dog Balthasar, who took every meal, he looked at Irene with a twinkle and said, "Well, there we are. Aren't they sweet? Have you any little ones among your pupils?" "Yes, 3, 2 of them darlings." "Pretty? Lovely." Old Jolyon sighed. He had an insatiable appetite for the very young. "My little sweet," he said, "is devoted to music. She'll be a musician some day. You wouldn't give me your opinion of her playing, I suppose?" "Of course I will." "You wouldn't like," but he stifled the words, "to give her lessons?" The idea that she gave lessons was unpleasant to him, yet it would mean that he would see her regularly. She left the piano and came over to his chair. "I would like, very much, but there is, June." "When are they coming back?" Old Jolyon frowned. "Not till the middle of next month." "What does that matter? You said June had forgiven me, but she could never forget, Uncle Jolyon." "Forget? She must forget, if he wanted her to." But as if answering, Irene shook her head. "You know she couldn't, one doesn't forget. Always that wretched past." And he said with a sort of vexed finality, "Well, we shall see." He talked to her an hour or more, of the children, and 100 little things, till the carriage came round to take her home. And when she had gone he went back to his chair, and sat there smoothing his face and chin, dreaming over the day. That evening after dinner he went to his study and took a sheet of paper. He stayed for some minutes without writing, then rose and stood under the masterpiece Dutch fishing boats at sunset. He was not thinking of that picture, but of his life. He was going to leave her something in his will. Nothing could so have stirred the stilly deeps of thought and memory. He was going to leave her a portion of his wealth, of his aspirations, deeds, qualities, work, all that had made that wealth, going to leave her, too, a part of all he had missed in life, by his sane and steady pursuit of wealth. All. What had he missed? Dutch fishing boats responded blankly. He crossed to the French window, and drawing the curtain aside, opened it. A wind had got up, and one of last year's oak leaves, which had somehow survived the gardener's brooms, was dragging itself with a tiny clicking rustle along the stone terrace in the twilight. Except for that, it was very quiet out there, and he could smell the heliotrope watered not long since. A bat went by. A bird uttered its last cheep. And right above the oak tree the first star shone. Faust in the opera had bartered his soul for some fresh years of youth. Morbid notion. No such bargain was possible, that was real tragedy. No making oneself new again for love or life or anything. Nothing left to do but enjoy beauty from afar off while you could, and leave it something in your will. But how much? And, as if he could not make that calculation looking out into the mild freedom of the country night, he turned back and went up to the chimney-piece. There were his pet bronzes, a Cleopatra with the asp at her breast, a Socrates, a greyhound playing with her puppy, a strong man reining in some horses. They last, he thought, and a pang went through his heart. They had 1,000 years of life before them. How much? Well, enough at all events to save her getting old before her time, to keep the lines out of her face as long as possible, and grey from soiling that bright hair. He might live another 5 years. She would be well over 30 by then. How much? She had none of his blood in her. In loyalty to the tenor of his life for 40 years and more, ever since he married and founded that mysterious thing, a family, came this warning thought: none of his blood, no right to anything. It was a luxury then, this notion. An extravagance, a petting of an old man's whim, one of those things done in dotage. His real future was vested in those who had his blood, in whom he would live on when he was gone. He turned away from the bronzes and stood looking at the old leather chair in which he had sat and smoked so many hundreds of cigars. And suddenly he seemed to see her sitting there in her grey dress, fragrant, soft, dark-eyed, graceful, looking up at him. Why? She cared nothing for him, really. All she cared for was that lost lover of hers. But she was there, whether she would or no, giving him pleasure with her beauty and grace. One had no right to inflict an old man's company, no right to ask her down to play to him and let him look at her, for no reward. Pleasure must be paid for in this world. How much? After all, there was plenty. His son and his 3 grandchildren would never miss that little lump. He had made it himself, nearly every penny. He could leave it where he liked, allow himself this little pleasure. He went back to the bureau. Well, I'm going to, he thought, let them think what they like. I'm going to. And he sat down. How much? 10,000, 20,000, how much? If only with his money he could buy 1 year, 1 month of youth. And startled by that thought, he wrote quickly, "Dear Herring, draw me a codicil to this effect: I leave to my niece Irene Forsyte, born Irene Heron, by which name she now goes, £15,000 free of legacy duty. Yours faithfully, Jolyon Forsyte. When he had sealed and stamped the envelope, he went back to the window and drew in a long breath. It was dark, but many stars shone now. For he woke at 2:30, an hour which long experience had taught him brings panic intensity to all awkward thoughts. Experience had also taught him that a further waking at the proper hour of 8 showed the folly of such panic. On this particular morning the thought which gathered rapid momentum was that if he became ill, at his age not improbable, he would not see her. From this it was but a step to realization that he would be cut off, too, when his son and June returned from Spain. How could he justify desire for the company of one who had stolen, early morning does not mince words, June's lover? That lover was dead, but June was a stubborn little thing, warm-hearted, but stubborn as wood, and, quite true, not one who forgot. By the middle of next month they would be back. He had barely 5 weeks left to enjoy the new interest which had come into what remained of his life. Darkness showed up to him absurdly clear the nature of his feeling. Admiration for beauty, a craving to see that which delighted his eyes. Preposterous, at his age. And yet, what other reason was there for asking June to undergo such painful reminder, and how prevent his son and his son's wife from thinking him very queer? He would be reduced to sneaking up to London, which tired him, and the least indisposition would cut him off even from that. He lay with eyes open, setting his jaw against the prospect, and calling himself an old fool, while his heart beat loudly, and then seemed to stop beating altogether. He had seen the dawn lighting the window chinks, heard the birds chirp and twitter, and the cocks crow, before he fell asleep again, and awoke tired but sane. 5 weeks before he need bother, at his age an eternity. But that early morning panic had left its mark, had slightly fevered the will of one who had always had his own way. He would see her as often as he wished. Why not go up to town and make that codicil at his solicitor's instead of writing about it? She might like to go to the opera. But, by train, for he would not have that fat chap Beacon grinning behind his back. Servants were such fools, and, as likely as not, they had known all the past history of Irene and young Bosinney. Servants knew everything, and suspected the rest. He wrote to her that morning, "My dear Irene, I have to be up in town tomorrow. If you would like to have a look in at the opera, come and dine with me quietly, but where?" It was decades since he had dined anywhere in London save at his club or at a private house. Ah! That new-fangled place close to Covent Garden. Let me have a line tomorrow morning to the Piedmont Hotel whether to expect you there at 7 o'clock. Yours affectionately, Jolyon Forsyte. She would understand that he just wanted to give her a little pleasure, for the idea that she should guess he had this itch to see her was instinctively unpleasant to him. It was not seemly that one so old should go out of his way to see beauty, especially in a woman. The journey next day, short though it was, and the visit to his lawyers, tired him. It was hot too, and after dressing for dinner he lay down on the sofa in his bedroom to rest a little. He must have had a sort of fainting fit, for he came to himself feeling very queer, and with some difficulty rose and rang the bell. Why? It was past 7. And there he was, and she would be waiting. But suddenly the dizziness came on again, and he was obliged to relapse on the sofa. He heard the maid's voice say, "Did you ring, sir?" "Yes, come here." He could not see her clearly, for the cloud in front of his eyes. "I'm not well, I want some sal volatile." "Yes, sir." Her voice sounded frightened. Old Jolyon made an effort. "Don't go. Take this message to my niece, a lady waiting in the hall, a lady in grey. Say Mr. Forsyte is not well, the heat. He is very sorry. If he is not down directly, she is not to wait dinner." When she was gone, he thought feebly, "Why did I say a lady in grey? She may be in anything. Sal volatile." He did not go off again, yet was not conscious of how Irene came to be standing beside him, holding smelling salts to his nose, and pushing a pillow up behind his head. He heard her say anxiously, "Dear Uncle Jolyon, what is it?" was dimly conscious of the soft pressure of her lips on his hand, then drew a long breath of smelling salts, suddenly discovered strength in them, and sneezed. "Ha," he said, "it's nothing. How did you get here? Go down and dine, the tickets are on the dressing table. I shall be all right in a minute." He felt her cool hand on his forehead, smelled violets, and sat divided between a sort of pleasure and a determination to be all right. "Why? You are in grey," he said. "Help me up." Once on his feet he gave himself a shake. What business had I to go off like that? And he moved very slowly to the glass. What a cadaverous chap. Her voice, behind him, murmured, "You mustn't come down, uncle, you must rest." Fiddlesticks. A glass of champagne'll soon set me to rights. I can't have you missing the opera. But the journey down the corridor was troublesome. What carpets they had in these new-fangled places, so thick that you tripped up in them at every step. In the lift he noticed how concerned she looked, and said with the ghost of a twinkle, "I'm a pretty host." When the lift stopped he had to hold firmly to the seat to prevent it slipping under him, but after soup and a glass of champagne he felt much better, and began to enjoy an infirmity which had brought such solicitude into her manner towards him. "I should have liked you for a daughter," he said suddenly, and watching the smile in her eyes, went on, "You mustn't get wrapped up in the past at your time of life. Plenty of that when you get to my age. That's a nice dress, I like the style. I made it myself." Ah! A woman who could make herself a pretty frock had not lost her interest in life. "Make hay while the sun shines," he said, "and drink that up. I want to see some color in your cheeks. We mustn't waste life, it doesn't do. There's a new Marguerite tonight, let's hope she won't be fat. And Mephisto, Anything more dreadful than a fat chap playing the devil I can't imagine. But they did not go to the opera after all, for in getting up from dinner the dizziness came over him again, and she insisted on his staying quiet and going to bed early. When he parted from her at the door of the hotel, having paid the cabman to drive her to Chelsea, he sat down again for a moment to enjoy the memory of her words, "You are such a darling to me, Uncle Jolyon." Why? Who wouldn't be? He would have liked to stay up another day and take her to the zoo, but 2 days running of him would bore her to death. No, he must wait till next Sunday, she had promised to come then. They would settle those lessons for Holly, if only for a month. It would be something. That little Mamselle Beauce wouldn't like it, but she would have to lump it. And crushing his old opera hat against his chest he sought the lift. He drove to Waterloo next morning, struggling with a desire to say, "Drive me to Chelsea." But his sense of proportion was too strong. Besides, he still felt shaky, and did not want to risk another aberration like that of last night, away from home. Holly, too, was expecting him, and what he had in his bag for her. Not that there was any cupboard love in his little sweet, she was a bundle of affection. Then, with the rather bitter cynicism of the old, he wondered for a second whether it was not cupboard love which made Irene put up with him. No, she was not that sort either. She had, if anything, too little notion of how to butter her bread, no sense of property, poor thing. Besides, he had not breathed a word about that codicil, nor should he, sufficient unto the day was the good thereof. In the victoria which met him at the station Holly was restraining the dog Balthasar, and their caresses made Jubei his drive home. All the rest of that fine hot day and most of the next he was content and peaceful, reposing in the shade, while the long lingering sunshine showered gold on the lawns and the flowers. But on Thursday evening at his lonely dinner he began to count the hours, 65 till he would go down to meet her again in the little coppice, and walk up through the fields at her side. He had intended to consult the doctor about his fainting fit, but the fellow would be sure to insist on quiet, no excitement and all that, and he did not mean to be tied by the leg, did not want to be told of an infirmity, if there were one, could not afford to hear of it at his time of life, now that this new interest had come. And he carefully avoided making any mention of it in a letter to his son. It would only bring them back with a run. How far this silence was due to consideration for their pleasure, how far to regard for his own, he did not pause to consider. That night in his study he had just finished his cigar and was dozing off, when he heard the rustle of a gown, and was conscious of a scent of violets. Opening his eyes he saw her, dressed in grey, standing by the fireplace, holding out her arms. The odd thing was that, though those arms seemed to hold nothing, they were curved as if round someone's neck, and her own neck was bent back, her lips open, her eyes closed. She vanished at once, and there were the mantelpiece and his bronzes. But those bronzes and the mantelpiece had not been there when she was, only the fireplace and the wall. Shaken and troubled, he got up. I must take medicine, he thought, I can't be well. His heart beat too fast, he had an asthmatic feeling in the chest, and going to the window, he opened it to get some air. A dog was barking far away, one of the dogs at Gage's farm no doubt, beyond the coppice. A beautiful still night, but dark. I dropped off, he mused, that's it. And yet I'll swear my eyes were open. A sound like a sigh seemed to answer. What's that? He said sharply, who's there? Putting his hand to his side to still the beating of his heart, he stepped out on the terrace. Something soft scurried by in the dark. Shoo! It was that great grey cat. Young Bosinney was like a great cat, he thought. It was him in there, that she was, he's got her still. He walked to the edge of the terrace, and looked down into the darkness. He could just see the powdering of the daisies on the unmown lawn. Here today and gone tomorrow. And there came the moon, who saw all, young and old, alive and dead, and didn't care a dump. His own turn soon. For a single day of youth he would give what was left. And he turned again towards the house. He could see the windows of the night nursery up there. His little sweet would be asleep. Hope that dog won't wake her, he thought. What is it makes us love, and makes us die? I must go to bed. And across the terrace stones, growing grey in the moonlight, he passed back within. How should an old man live his days if not in dreaming of his well-spent past? In that, at all events, there is no agitating warmth, only pale winter sunshine. The shell can withstand the gentle beating of the dynamos of memory. The present he should distrust, the future shun. From beneath thick shade he should watch the sunlight creeping at his toes. If there be sun of summer, let him not go out into it, mistaking it for the Indian summer sun. Thus peradventure he shall decline softly, slowly, imperceptibly, until impatient nature clutches his windpipe and he gasps away to death some early morning before the world is aired, and they put on his tombstone, in the fullness of years, yet. If he preserve his principles in perfect order, a Forsyte may live on long after he is dead. Old Jolyon was conscious of all this, and yet there was in him that which transcended Forsyteism. For it is written that a Forsyte shall not love beauty more than reason, nor his own way more than his own health. And something beat within him in these days that with each throb fretted at the thinning shell. His sagacity knew this, but it knew too that he could not stop that beating, nor would if he could. And yet, if you had told him he was living on his capital, he would have stared you down. No, no, a man did not live on his capital, it was not done. The shibboleths of the past are ever more real than the actualities of the present. And he, to whom living on one's capital had always been anathema, could not have borne to have applied so gross a phrase to his own case. Pleasure is healthful, beauty good to see, to live again in the youth of the young, and what else on earth was he doing? Methodically, as had been the way of his whole life, he now arranged his time. On Tuesdays he journeyed up to town by train. Irene came and dined with him, and they went to the opera. On Thursdays he drove to town, and, putting that fat chap and his horses up, met her in Kensington Gardens, picking up the carriage after he had left her, and driving home again in time for dinner. He threw out the casual formula that he had business in London on those 2 days. On Wednesdays and Saturdays she came down to give Holly music lessons. The greater the pleasure he took in her society, the more scrupulously fastidious he became, just a matter-of-fact and friendly uncle. Not even in feeling, really, was he more, for, after all, there was his age. And yet, if she were late he fidgeted himself to death. If she missed coming, which happened twice, his eyes grew sad as an old dog's, and he failed to sleep. And so a month went by, a month of summer in the fields, and in his heart, with summer's heat and the fatigue thereof. Who could have believed a few weeks back that he would have looked forward to his son's and his granddaughter's return with something like dread? There was such a delicious freedom, such recovery of that independence a man enjoys before he founds a family, about these weeks of lovely weather, and this new companionship with one who demanded nothing, and remained always a little unknown, retaining the fascination of mystery. It was like a draught of wine to him who has been drinking water for so long that he has almost forgotten the stir wine brings to his blood, the narcotic to his brain. The flowers were colored brighter, scents and music and the sunlight had a living value, were no longer mere reminders of past enjoyment. There was something now to live for which stirred him continually to anticipation. He lived in that, not in retrospection. The difference is considerable to any so old as he. The pleasures of the table, never of much consequence to one naturally abstemious, had lost all value. He ate little, without knowing what he ate, and every day grew thinner and more worn to look at. He was again a thread paper. And to this thinned form his massive forehead, with hollows at the temples, gave more dignity than ever. He was very well aware that he ought to see the doctor, but liberty was too sweet. He could not afford to pet his frequent shortness of breath and the pain in his side at the expense of liberty. Return to the vegetable existence he had led among the agricultural journals with the life-size mangold wurzels, before this new attraction came into his life, no. He exceeded his allowance of cigars. 2 a day had always been his rule. Now he smoked 3 and sometimes 4, a man will when he is filled with the creative spirit. But very often he thought, I must give up smoking, and coffee, I must give up rattling up to town. But he did not, there was no one in any sort of authority to notice him, and this was a priceless boon. The servants perhaps wondered, but they were, naturally, dumb. Mamselle Beauce was too concerned with her own digestion, and too well bred to make personal allusions. Holly had not as yet an eye for the relative appearance of him who was her plaything and her god. It was left for Irene herself to beg him to eat more, to rest in the hot part of the day, to take a tonic, and so forth. But she did not tell him that she was the cause of his thinness, for one cannot see the havoc oneself is working. A man of 85 has no passions, but the beauty which produces passion works on in the old way, till death closes the eyes which crave the sight of her. On the first day of the second week in July he received a letter from his son in Paris to say that they would all be back on Friday. This had always been more sure than fate, but, with the pathetic improvidence given to the old, that they may endure to the end, he had never quite admitted it. Now he did, and something would have to be done. He had ceased to be able to imagine life without this new interest, but that which is not imagined sometimes exists, as foresights are perpetually finding to their cost. He sat in his old leather chair, doubling up the letter, and mumbling with his lips the end of an unlighted cigar. After tomorrow his Tuesday expeditions to town would have to be abandoned. He could still drive up, perhaps, once a week, on the pretext of seeing his man of business. But even that would be dependent on his health, for now they would begin to fuss about him. The lessons. The lessons must go on. She must swallow down her scruples, and June must put her feelings in her pocket. She had done so once, on the day after the news of Bossony's death. What she had done then, she could surely do again now. 4 years since that injury was inflicted on her, not Christian to keep the memory of old sores alive. June's will was strong, but his was stronger, for his sands were running out. Irene was soft, surely she would do this for him, subdue her natural shrinking, sooner than give him pain. The lessons must continue, for if they did, he was secure. And lighting his cigar at last, he began trying to shape out how to put it to them all, and explain this strange intimacy, how to veil and wrap it away from the naked truth, that he could not bear to be deprived of the sight of beauty. Ah! Holly. Holly was fond of her, Holly liked her lessons. She would save him, his little sweet. And with that happy thought he became serene, and wondered what he had been worrying about so fearfully. He must not worry, it left him always curiously weak, and as if but half present in his own body. That evening after dinner he had a return of the dizziness, though he did not faint. He would not ring the bell, because he knew it would mean a fuss, and make his going up on the morrow more conspicuous. When one grew old, the whole world was in conspiracy to limit freedom, and for what reason? Just to keep the breath in him a little longer. He did not want it at such cost. Only the dog Balthasar saw his lonely recovery from that weakness, anxiously watched his master go to the sideboard and drink some brandy, instead of giving him a biscuit. When at last old Jolyon felt able to tackle the stairs he went up to bed. And, though still shaky next morning, the thought of the evening sustained and strengthened him. It was always such a pleasure to give her a good dinner. He suspected her of undereating when she was alone, and, at the opera to watch her eyes glow and brighten, the unconscious smiling of her lips. She hadn't much pleasure, and this was the last time he would be able to give her that treat. but when he was packing his bag he caught himself wishing that he had not the fatigue of dressing for dinner before him, and the exertion, too, of telling her about June's return. The opera that evening was Carmen, and he chose the last entr'acte to break the news, instinctively putting it off till the latest moment. She took it quietly, queerly. In fact, he did not know how she had taken it before the wayward music lifted up again and silence became necessary. The mask was down over her face, that mask behind which so much went on that he could not see. She wanted time to think it over, no doubt. He would not press her, for she would be coming to give her lesson tomorrow afternoon, and he should see her then when she had got used to the idea. In the cab he talked only of the Carmen he had seen better in the old days, but this one was not bad at all. When he took her hand to say good night, she bent quickly forward and kissed his forehead. "Goodbye, dear Uncle Jolyon, you have been so sweet to me." "Tomorrow then," he said. "Good night. Sleep well." She echoed softly, "Sleep well," and from the cab window, already moving away, he saw her face screwed round towards him, and her hand put out in a gesture which seemed to linger. He sought his room slowly. They never gave him the same, and he could not get used to these spick and spandy bedrooms with new furniture and grey-green carpets sprinkled all over with pink roses. He was wakeful, and that wretched habanera kept throbbing in his head. His French had never been equal to its words, but its sense he knew, if it had any sense, a gypsy thing, wild and unaccountable. Well, there was in life something which upset all your care and plans, something which made men and women dance to its pipes. And he lay staring from deep-sunk eyes into the darkness where the unaccountable held sway. You thought you had hold of life, but it slipped away behind you, took you by the scruff of the neck, forced you here and forced you there, and then, likely as not, squeezed life out of you. It took the very stars like that, he shouldn't wonder, rubbed their noses together and flung them apart. It had never done playing its pranks. 5 million people in this great blunderbuss of a town, and all of them at the mercy of that life force, like a lot of little dried peas hopping about on a board when you struck your fist on it. Ah, well. Himself would not hop much longer. A good long sleep would do him good. How hot it was up here, how noisy. His forehead burned. She had kissed it just where he always worried, just there, as if she had known the very place and wanted to kiss it all away for him. But, instead, her lips left a patch of grievous uneasiness. She had never spoken in quite that voice, had never before made that lingering gesture or looked back at him as she drove away. He got out of bed and pulled the curtains aside. His room faced down over the river. There was little air, but the sight of that breadth of water flowing by, calm, eternal, soothed him. The great thing, he thought, is not to make myself a nuisance. I'll think of my little sweet, and go to sleep. But it was long before the heat and throbbing of the London night died out into the short slumber of the summer morning. And old Jolyon had but 40 winks. When he reached home next day he went out to the flower garden, and with the help of Holly, who was very delicate with flowers, gathered a great bunch of carnations. They were, he told her, for the lady in grey, a name still banded between them, and he put them in a bowl in his study where he meant to tackle Irene the moment she came, on the subject of June and future lessons. Their fragrance and color would help. After lunch he lay down, for he felt very tired, and the carriage would not bring her from the station till 4 o'clock. But as the hour approached he grew restless, and sought the schoolroom, which overlooked the drive. The sun blinds were down, and Holly was there with Mademoiselle Beauce, sheltered from the heat of a stifling July day, attending to their silkworms. Old Jolyon had a natural antipathy to these methodical creatures, whose heads and color reminded him of elephants, who nibbled such quantities of holes in nice green leaves, and smelled, as he thought, horrid. He sat down on a chintz-covered window seat whence he could see the drive, and get what air there was, and the dog Balthasar, who appreciated chintz on hot days, jumped up beside him. Over the cottage piano a violet dust sheet, faded almost to grey, was spread, and on it the first lavender, whose scent filled the room. In spite of the coolness here, perhaps because of that coolness the beat of life vehemently impressed his ebbed-down senses. Each sunbeam which came through the chinks had annoying brilliance. That dog smelled very strong, the lavender perfume was overpowering, those silkworms heaving up their grey-green backs seemed horribly alive, and Holly's dark head bent over them had a wonderfully silky sheen. A marvelous cruelly strong thing was life when you were old and weak. It seemed to mock you with its multitude of forms and its beating vitality. He had never, till those last few weeks, had this curious feeling of being with one half of him eagerly borne along in the stream of life, and with the other half left on the bank, watching that helpless progress. Only when Irene was with him did he lose this double consciousness. Holly turned her head, pointed with her little brown fist to the piano, for to point with a finger was not well bred, and said slyly, "Look at the lady in grey, Gran, isn't she pretty today?" Old Jolyon's heart gave a flutter, and for a second the room was clouded. Then it cleared, and he said with a twinkle, "Who's been dressing her up?" "Mam'selle." "Holly." "Don't be foolish. That prim little French woman." She hadn't yet got over the music lessons being taken away from her. That wouldn't help. His little sweet was the only friend they had. Well, they were her lessons. And he shouldn't budge for anything. He stroked the warm wool on Balthasar's head, and heard Holly say, "When Mother's home, there won't be any changes, will there? She doesn't like strangers, you know." The child's words seemed to bring the chilly atmosphere of opposition about old Jolyon, and disclose all the menace to his new-found freedom. Ah! He would have to resign himself to being an old man at the mercy of care and love, or fight to keep this new and prized companionship, and to fight tired him to death. But his thin, worn face hardened into resolution till it appeared all jaw. This was his house, and his affair, he should not budge. He looked at his watch, old and thin like himself. He had owned it 50 years. Past 4 already. And kissing the top of Holly's head in passing, he went down to the hall. He wanted to get hold of her before she went up to give her lesson. At the first sound of wheels he stepped out into the porch, and saw at once that the Victoria was empty. "The train's in, sir, but the lady hasn't come." Old Jolyon gave him a sharp upward look. His eyes seemed to push away that fat chap's curiosity, and defy him to see the bitter disappointment he was feeling. "Very well," he said, and turned back into the house. He went to his study and sat down, quivering like a leaf. What did this mean? She might have lost her train, but he knew well enough she hadn't. "Goodbye, dear Uncle Jolyon." Why goodbye and not good night? And that hand of hers lingering in the air. And her kiss. What did it mean? Vehement alarm and irritation took possession of him. He got up and began to pace the Turkey carpet, between window and wall. She was going to give him up. He felt it for certain, and he defenseless. An old man wanting to look on beauty. It was ridiculous. Age closed his mouth, paralyzed his power to fight. He had no right to what was warm and living, no right to anything but memories and sorrow. He could not plead with her. Even an old man has his dignity. Defenseless. For an hour, lost to bodily fatigue, he paced up and down, past the bowl of carnations he had plucked, which mocked him with its scent. Of all things hard to bear, the prostration of willpower is hardest, for one who has always had his way. Nature had got him in its net, and like an unhappy fish he turned and swam at the meshes, here and there, found no hole, no breaking point. They brought him tea at 5 o'clock, and a letter. For a moment hope beat up in him. He cut the envelope with the butter knife, and read, "Dearest Uncle Jolyon, I can't bear to write anything that may disappoint you, but I was too cowardly to tell you last night. I feel I can't come down and give Holly any more lessons, now that June is coming back. Some things go too deep to be forgotten. It has been such a joy to see you and Holly. Perhaps I shall still see you sometimes when you come up, though I'm sure it's not good for you. I can see you are tiring yourself too much. I believe you ought to rest quite quietly all this hot weather, and now you have your son and June coming back you will be so happy. Thank you a million times for all your sweetness to me. Lovingly your Irene." So, there it was. Not good for him to have pleasure and what he chiefly cared about, to try and put off feeling the inevitable end of all things, the approach of death with its stealthy, rustling footsteps. Not good for him. Not even she could see how she was his new lease of interest in life, the incarnation of all the beauty he felt slipping from him. His tea grew cold, his cigar remained unlit, and up and down he paced, torn between his dignity and his hold on life. Intolerable to be squeezed out slowly, without a say of your own, to live on when your will was in the hands of others bent on weighing you to the ground with care and love. Intolerable. He would see what telling her the truth would do, the truth that he wanted the sight of her more than just a lingering on. He sat down at his old bureau and took a pen. But he could not write. There was something revolting in having to plead like this, plead that she should warm his eyes with her beauty. It was tantamount to confessing dotage. He simply could not. And instead, he wrote, I had hoped that the memory of old sores would not be allowed to stand in the way of what is a pleasure and a profit to me and my little granddaughter. But old men learn to forego their whims. They are obliged to. Even the whim to live must be foregone sooner or later, and perhaps the sooner the better. My love to you, Jolyon Forsyte. Bitter, he thought, but I can't help it. I'm tired. He sealed and dropped it into the box for the evening post, and hearing it fall to the bottom, thought, there goes all I've looked forward to. That evening after dinner, which he scarcely touched, after his cigar which he left half smoked for it made him feel faint, he went very slowly upstairs and stole into the night nursery. He sat down on the window seat. A night light was burning, and he could just see Holly's face, with one hand underneath the cheek. An early cockchafer buzzed in the Japanese paper with which they had filled the grate, and one of the horses in the stable stamped restlessly. To sleep like that child. He pressed apart 2 rungs of the Venetian blind and looked out. The moon was rising, blood red. He had never seen so red a moon. The woods and fields out there were dropping to sleep too, in the last glimmer of the summer light. And beauty, like a spirit, walked. I've had a long life, he thought, the best of nearly everything. I'm an ungrateful chap, I've seen a lot of beauty in my time. Poor young Bosinney said I had a sense of beauty. There's a man in the moon tonight. A moth went by, another. Ladies in grey. He closed his eyes. A feeling that he would never open them again beset him. He let it grow, let himself sink, then, with a shiver, dragged the lids up. There was something wrong with him, no doubt, deeply wrong. He would have to have the doctor after all. It didn't much matter now. Into that coppice the moonlight would have crept, there would be shadows, and those shadows would be the only things awake. No birds, beasts, flowers, insects, just the shadows, moving, ladies in grey. Over that log they would climb, would whisper together. She and Bosinney. Funny thought. And the frogs and little things would whisper too. How the clock ticked, in here. It was all eerie, out there in the light of that red moon, in here with the little steady night light and the ticking clock and the nurse's dressing gown hanging from the edge of the screen, tall, like a woman's figure. Lady in grey. And a very odd thought beset him, did she exist? Had she ever come at all? Or was she but the emanation of all the beauty he had loved and must leave so soon? The violet-grey spirit with the dark eyes and the crown of amber hair, who walks the dawn and the moonlight, and at bluebell time. What was she? Who was she? Did she exist? He rose and stood a moment clutching the windowsill, to give him a sense of reality again, then began tiptoeing towards the door. He stopped at the foot of the bed, and Holly, as if conscious of his eyes fixed on her, stirred, sighed, and curled up closer in defense. He tiptoed on and passed out into the dark passage, reached his room, undressed at once, and stood before a mirror in his night shirt. What a scarecrow, with temples fallen in, and thin legs. His eyes resisted his own image, and a look of pride came on his face. All was in league to pull him down, even his reflection in the glass, but he was not down, yet. He got into bed, and lay a long time without sleeping, trying to reach resignation, only too well aware that fretting and disappointment were very bad for him. He woke in the morning so unrefreshed and strengthless that he sent for the doctor. After sounding him, the fellow pulled a face as long as your arm, and ordered him to stay in bed and give up smoking. That was no hardship, there was nothing to get up for, and when he felt ill, tobacco always lost its savor. He spent the morning languidly with the sun blinds down, turning and returning the Times, not reading much, the dog Balthasar lying beside his bed. With his lunch they brought him a telegram, running thus: "Your letter received coming down this afternoon will be with you at 4:30. Irene." Coming down. After all. Then she did exist, and he was not deserted. Coming down. A glow ran through his limbs, his cheeks and forehead felt hot. He drank his soup, and pushed the tray table away, lying very quiet until they had removed lunch and left him alone, but every now and then his eyes twinkled. Coming down. His heart beat fast, and then did not seem to beat at all. At 3 o'clock he got up and dressed deliberately, noiselessly. Holly and Mamselle would be in the schoolroom, and the servants asleep after their dinner, he shouldn't wonder. He opened his door cautiously, and went downstairs. In the hall the dog Balthasar lay solitary, and, followed by him, old Jolyon passed into his study and out into the burning afternoon. He meant to go down and meet her in the coppice, but felt at once he could not manage that in this heat. He sat down instead under the oak tree by the swing, and the dog Balthasar, who also felt the heat, lay down beside him. He sat there smiling. What a revel of bright minutes! What a hum of insects, and cooing of pigeons! It was the quintessence of a summer day. Lovely. And he was happy, happy as a sandboy, whatever that might be. She was coming, she had not given him up. He had everything in life he wanted, except a little more breath, and less weight, just here. He would see her when she emerged from the fernery, come swaying just a little, a violet-grey figure passing over the daisies and dandelions and soldiers on the lawn, the soldiers with their flowery crowns. He would not move, but she would come up to him and say, "Dear Uncle Jolyon, I am sorry," and sit in the swing and let him look at her and tell her that he had not been very well but was all right now, and that dog would lick her hand. That dog knew his master was fond of her, that dog was a good dog. It was quite shady under the tree, the sun could not get at him, only make the rest of the world bright so that he could see the grand stand at Epsom away out there, very far, and the cows cropping the clover in the field and swishing at the flies with their tails. He smelled the scent of limes and lavender. Ah! That was why there was such a racket of bees. They were excited, busy, as his heart was busy and excited. Drowsy, too, drowsy and drugged on honey and happiness, as his heart was drugged and drowsy. Summer, summer, they seemed saying, great bees and little bees, and the flies too. The stable clock struck 4, in half an hour she would be here. He would have just one tiny nap, because he had had so little sleep of late, and then he would be fresh for her, fresh for youth and beauty, coming towards him across the sunlit lawn, lady in grey. And settling back in his chair he closed his eyes. Some thistledown came on what little air there was, and pitched on his moustache more white than itself. He did not know, but his breathing stirred it, caught there. A ray of sunlight struck through and lodged on his boot. A bumblebee alighted and strolled on the crown of his Panama hat. And the delicious surge of slumber reached the brain beneath that hat, and the head swayed forward and rested on his breast. Summer, summer. So went the hum. The stable clock struck the 1/4. The dog Balthasar stretched and looked up at his master. The thistledown no longer moved. The dog placed his chin over the sunlit foot. It did not stir. The dog withdrew his chin quickly, rose, and leaped on old Jolien's lap, looked in his face, whined, then, leaping down, sat on his haunches, gazing up. And suddenly he uttered a long, long howl. But the thistledown was still as death, and the face of his old master. Summer, summer, summer. The soundless footsteps on the grass. 1917. Asterisk 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 end of the Project Gutenberg ebook 5 tail asterisk